Before we begin, what time is it where you are? And where are you listening from? If you enjoy calm, quiet history to fall asleep to, subscribe for more. And if there's a topic you'd like to hear, leave it in the comments. I do read them now. Let's begin. Asterisk in the soft warmth of southern France. Sometime near the close of the 13th century, Toulouse was a place of crooked alleys, spiced wind, and a city divided by whispered names. People did not say witch or midwife too loudly. Both names could mean the same thing, depending on who was listening. In a dark-walled house not far from the Garonne River, a woman named Maud de Carcassonne recorded every birth she attended in a plain book of rough parchment. The ink was faded in places where her fingers had trembled. She had not learned to write until she was past 30. Her letters leaned sideways like reeds in wind, but she wrote anyway, carefully, quietly. That book would one day be used against her. Maud was a midwife, not the only one in Toulouse, but perhaps the most experienced. The church didn't certify women. They couldn't. There was no license for a woman who had never studied Latin, but Maud had learned from bodies, from the groans of women laboring by candlelight, and from the old women who had taught her about herbs that soothed cramping or brought the bleeding down. She knew what fever smelled like in a newborn. She knew what oil to press against the spine of a woman whose breath came short in her 8th month. She had helped deliver over 300 infants. Most of them lived. Some of them did not. It's recorded both. This was unusual. Most midwives didn't keep ledgers. They remembered or whispered it to their daughters. But Maud had no daughter, only a husband who had died years ago of a cough, and 2 sons who had become tanners and now lived on the far side of the city. So she wrote. What she did not know was that the scribes of the local cathedral had begun to take notice. They were not bothered by her knowledge, not openly, but she was known to use mugwort and pennyroyal. She made salves for hemorrhoids and rashes. She had once reset a broken hand after a neighbor fell from a mule cart. Canned. She charged nothing but a loaf of bread. None of this would have mattered if it weren't for the child of a local noblewoman. The woman had gone into labor early, her body weakened by age and by the loss of 3 earlier pregnancies. The family had sent for Maud quietly, urgently. The church physicians were too slow, too clean, too male. They waited for signs that didn't arrive. Maud arrived in the night, said nothing to the household steward, and brought a small bundle of herbs with her. The child survived. The mother did not by morning. Rumors began to ripple through the district like wind through dry reeds. Did Maud use herbs to stop the bleeding? Did she pray? Or did she chant? Why did she keep the placenta? The midwife never spoke of that night again. But a steward's boy had seen her burn something in a brass bowl before she left. He told his cousin, who told a priest, who wrote it down. A few months passed. The ledger grew. Then one day, a scholar from the cathedral approached Maud under the pretense of praise. He asked to see her notes. Key said the bishop was curious about her insight. He said it might be helpful to preserve her records, that her work might one day help others. She handed it over. She had no reason to doubt him. He was young, well-dressed, and gentle in manner. He spoke to her as if she were learned, as if she belonged. But when he left, she felt an emptiness she couldn't name. Her ledger never came back. 2 weeks later, she was summoned before the bishop's consistory court. The charge was not witchcraft. Not at first. That would have been too obvious. Instead, they accused her of practicing medicine without authorization. The implication was clear. Healing was a male profession. Even if women had been healing long before the church began taking notes, the questions were absurd. They asked if she had ever seen a demon during childbirth, if she had used prayer or incantation, if she had ever predicted a stillbirth. Maud tried to answer plainly. She said that childbirth sometimes brought visions that she had once seen. A woman say goodbye to her unborn child even before it passed. Cass sometimes. Yes, she had felt something unexplainable, okay? But she did not call it magic. She called it grief. The room grew cold. Then they produced her ledger. They had underlined entries in red, notations about herbal mixtures, a sentence describing how to ease pain using warmed saltstones wrapped in cloth, an observation that sometimes firstborns arrived feet first, something she had witnessed dozens of times, but which contradicted the cathedral's understanding of natural birth. They called it heresy. Maud was confused. She didn't even know what part of her words were considered unholy. She had written what she saw, what she had done. There was no pretense in her book, no power claimed, no spells, but there were too many men in the room, too many robes, too many notes already written before she opened her mouth. By the end of the hearing, she was placed under house arrest and told not to practice again. The women in the neighborhood still came to her quietly at night. They brought eggs instead of bread now, but they still came. And then, one night, a baby died. Maud had arrived too late. The mother had bled for hours before anyone had summoned help. And the bishop's men were quick to blame the midwife, not the delay. They arrived the next morning with papers already signed, not for trial, for execution. She was called a danger to the city, not because she failed, but because she knew too much. When she was taken, the neighborhood watched silently. Some wept, most looked away. Few even muttered prayers for her soul, just loud enough to be heard by the bishop's scribes. They burned her ledger first, in front of her, page by page, till all her notes turned to gray ash and floated, upward like ghostly seeds. They called it purification, but what the scribes didn't know is that Maud had taught one girl to read, and the girl had copied every page. She had hidden it in the cellar of a bakery, wrapped in waxed cloth and placed in a wooden box meant for salt. The copy would one day be found nearly for centuries later during renovations on the old Vieux des Frères. But by then, too many other women like Maud had already disappeared, and no one ever asked what happened to the girl who hid the copy. Asterisk. They never recorded her name, not in any of the court registers, not in the pages of confession, not in the careful ledgers of the bishop's records, where even the dimensions of a heretic cell were neatly written down. She was just listed, once barely legible, in the margin of an old inventory. A girl of uncertain age present at the arrest, not taken. She had been there the morning Maud was led away. The kitchen air thick with yeast and something sour, her fingers still dusted with flour from the morning's work. Her mother had sent her to fetch leavening from the midwife, who often kept dried apple slices, sage, and scraps of salt-pickled rennet from previous births. But she arrived late. The men were already there, and Maud, who had taught her to read, slowly, syllable by syllable, using old scraps of scripture and ink made from ash, did not look at her. Not once. The girl didn't cry. Not then. She simply memorized everything. The smell of iron, the deep blue of Maud's shawl, the way one of the scribes carried a book as though it was something dangerous. She noticed how no one offered Maud a chance to speak freely. They read from a parchment instead. The girl didn't understand every word, but she could hear when the tone shifted from accusation to sentence. It sounded like iron gates closing, and just like that, Maud was gone. But her words weren't. Not entirely. That evening, the girl returned to Maud's house before the guards had finished their inventory. She slipped in through the courtyard wall, her feet practiced and quick, and searched the dark corners for the wooden chest Maud had kept her ink in. Not the one they'd taken, a different one, hidden beneath the kitchen shelf, near the roots Maud never used in her mixtures. Inside it, she found 3 scraps, all copies, pages Maud had made for teaching, notes on breech births, chart comparing bleeding afterbirths with normal ones, and a strange diagram showing a woman's belly from the side, shaped like a crescent moon. The girl took them and ran. Over the next 2 years, she wrote every word she could remember from Maud's teachings, not in the cathedral script, but in her own awkward scrawl, half phonetic, half guesswork. She wrote in the dark. She wrote with charcoal when ink ran dry. She wrote on paper made from flour sacks, and when the baker's wife asked what she was doing, she said, keeping track of the flour. But flour doesn't come with diagrams. She was careful, more careful than Maud. She never gave remedies to anyone. She never answered questions about herbs. She just baked, watched, and wrote. Until one day, her notes caught the eye of someone else, a visiting scholar from Montpellier, someone studying the popular beliefs of the countryside, heard rumors of a baker's apprentice who kept notes on female healing and old birthing chants. He didn't report her. He interviewed her. She said little, but he offered a trade. He would teach her Latin in exchange for her help translating a list of midwives. Names from the bishop's confiscated documents. Names written phonetically in Oxida. Names he could not read. She agreed. The lessons lasted only 6 weeks. Then the scholar returned to Montpellier and disappeared into the recordless sea of men who published anonymously. But before leaving, he gave her one thing, an empty manuscript. Blank vellum, unlined, clean. She began again. The girl wrote with new care, this time in both tongues Occitan and Latin. She even began adding notes from whispered stories she'd heard in the marketplace of women whose children had survived fevers because of blue thistle baths, of a grandmother who had once calmed a seizure with smoldering rosemary and a hymn in the old tongue. These stories never made it into university lectures, but they lived here in the folds of her bound pages. Meanwhile, the church was beginning its quiet shift. By the early 1300s, male surgeons trained in Latin, sanctioned by church authority, began systematically collecting female birthing knowledge and translating it into official texts. They claimed they were preserving it. Perhaps they were, but they changed the names. They removed the herbs they didn't understand. They added saints' names to charms that had once been sung by heart-fire midwives. They replaced fennel root with prayers to Saint Margaret. They called it medicine, they called it science, and the women who had taught them, through stolen notes or whispered tradition, began to vanish from the records. Maud was never mentioned again in court papers, but in a single obscure manuscript from Toulouse, now in the holdings of a French university archive under the file name IMS 1440. Place there is a reference to M.D. Carcassonia, who applied compresses made of heated milk and vinegar to the hips of laboring women with marked success. It is the only surviving citation. The rest is folded into medical Latin, attributed to male scholars, and later referenced by textbooks as common 14th century obstetric knowledge. The girl who watched Maud die continued baking bread until she was 30. Then, without warning, she left Toulouse. Her name does not appear in city rolls after that, but a manuscript nearly identical in structure to hers appears 50 years later in Avignon, copied, expanded, and attributed to a male monk who died before it could be published. Historians still argue over who wrote it. They say the style is unusual, that the Latin is laced with regional inflection, that it lacks scholarly detachment and reads more like a diary than a manual. They don't realize what they're reading. Not a manual, but a memory, a girl's memory of a midwife, a woman, burned because she dared to write what she saw. And, still, no one has ever discovered the rest of the ledger. The one said to have been copied and hidden in the bakery cellar. Was it real? Or just a story told by villagers trying to preserve a little dignity for a woman no one could save. And if it was real, who has it now? Asterisk. The field where Maud de Carcassonne was burned was once used for drying linens. It lay behind the old southern gate of Toulouse, between a crumbling Roman wall and a vineyard that no longer bore fruit. The church called it neutral ground. The people called it the place where the air smelled wrong. By the 15th century, no one remembered her name clearly, only that once a woman had been taken there at dawn, and that a clerk from the bishop's court had arrived late and missed the execution entirely, only to ask later if anyone had kept her ashes for records. The silence that followed his question was the only answer he received, and yet the woman's knowledge remained, not in libraries, not in universities, but in kitchens, behind bakery walls, and scraps sewn into hems of aprons, and quietly murmured in the back rooms of childbirths. The women who followed her, students, neighbors, daughters of friends, did not speak her name, not because they feared it, but because they feared what the name might invite. The church didn't stop with Maud. Throughout the next century, more women like her were accused, burned, or simply disappeared. Some for using sage, some for owning mortars and pestles, some for reading. And yet, male physicians continued to collect their knowledge, sometimes word for word. In 1438, a medical student from Paris wrote of a newly discovered method of easing posterior births by placing warm cloths along the spine. He credited the practice to a certain Brother Lambert of Lyon, but in the margins of his textbook, someone else had scribbled a note, learned from a woman of the South. There is no other mention of her. This was how it always happened. A woman discovered the method. A man documented it. The church translated it. The universities adopted it. And the woman disappeared. But not always completely. Centuries later, in the 1890s, when workers began renovating the old stone bakery on what had become Rue du Sel, they discovered a warped wooden box wedged deep behind a wall. The cellar had collapsed decades earlier, but the remnants of the foundation remained. Inside the box was a bundle of stained cloth, as hard as bark from the moisture and time. When carefully pulled apart, it revealed dozens of folded pages, ink faded to brown, edges brittle, language unfamiliar. At first glance, the workers thought they had found a stash of church documents. A priest was called, then a historian, then, eventually, a team from the local university. What they found stunned them. There were no grand claims, no spells, no confessions, just observations, a record of labors, symptoms, stillbirths, remedies, diagrams of infant positions, notes on pulse, list of plants and their warming or cooling properties, warnings about overuse, suggestions for herbal tonics, and always, the date, the name of the mother, and whether the child lived. The scholar who examined the pages believed it to be a rare lay. Midwife's record from the late 13th or early 14th century. It was unsigned. The writing was inconsistent. The spelling changed. Some pages had corrections and notes in a second hand. Others were pressed with thumbprints in ink. No one could say for sure whether it belonged to Maud or the girl who had followed her, but they knew it was real. The manuscript was eventually cataloged under a neutral label, Anonymous Female Midwives. Notes, South France Collection. It was placed in the university archives, beside more official medical texts, those written by men who had never delivered a child. It remains one of the only surviving first-hand accounts of medieval childbirth, written by a woman. And yet, no public exhibitions mention her, no textbook reproduces her diagrams, no bronze plaque marks the site where her ledger was once read aloud in court as evidence of heresy, because history, written by institutions, often moves like water around a stone, smooth, selective, forgetting what it erodes. But not all stories are forgotten. In Toulouse, there is a quiet superstition among a few families, most of them descended from old Baker lines. They don't speak of witches or saints or bishops, but when a girl is born, some of them still place a thistle flower over the doorway, not because they believe in magic, but because they believe in memory. They believe that somewhere in the quiet folds of time, a woman wrote what she saw, and that even when burned, even when erased, her words still matter. They believe that a midwife once walked through streets no one dared walk at night, with nothing but herbs in her pouch and a head full of knowledge. They believe that survival has a scent clove, vinegar, dried mint, and they believe that silence has shape, and ink has memory, and ashes leave stories behind if you know where to look. And so, her story ends not with a scream or a fire, but with the quiet scratching of a girl's pen in the dark, and with the question we must still ask: how many more women healed and were never written down? Asterisk. The Rhine flowed cold and steady through the green hills of 12th century Germany. Banks, dotted with early vineyards and hard stone abbeys, were home to men who copied scripture by candlelight and spoke in Latin, even when no one was listening. But one voice along the Rhine was different, higher, clearer, and not in Latin. It was a woman's voice. Her name was Hildegard von Bingen, and she did not just write, she saw. So she claimed. Born in 1098, Hildegard entered the religious life before she was even a teenager. She was what the church called an oblata, child handed over to the monastery in a quiet transaction that involved no paperwork and little ceremony. Her family, minor nobles with no estate to pass down, considered it an honorable path, fewer mouths to feed, a soul committed to God, a daughter safely removed from inheritance disputes. But Hildegard did not simply fade into cloistered silence. From an early age, she experienced what she later called visions. She described light entering her mind like a burning wind, a brightness not of the eyes, but of the soul. These visions, often involving nature, creation, the body, and divine order, would one day be written down in brilliant, almost surreal illustrations and thick volumes of text. The church was cautious with visionaries, especially women, sizing. They were valuable sometimes, but dangerous. To Dot, Hildegard kept quiet, but as she aged, her visions intensified. Around age 42, at an age when most medieval women were long forgotten, by record, she began to write them down. Not in Latin, not at first. She wrote in her native German, plain speech, words her fellow sisters could understand. And what she wrote was not just about heaven. She wrote about the body, about digestion, sleep, sex, herbs. She wrote that every human organ had a spiritual as well as physical role. She said the liver was not just a filter, but a seat of emotion, that the lungs were connected to faith, that certain plants, if taken in a tea at dawn, could ease melancholy. The church grew nervous, not because she was wrong. Many of her ideas were in line with ancient Greek theory, but because she was not citing men. She didn't quote Galen or Hippocrates or the newly rediscovered Aristotle. She quoted light and wind and sky. Her work became famous despite this. Her first major book, Civius, short for Know the Ways, was not a medical manual but a spiritual one. It brought her attention from popes and kings. She was asked to speak. She wrote letters to emperors. She even founded her own convent on the Rupertsberg, far from the control of male abbots. But it was her lesser-known works that truly disturbed the hierarchy. Physica and Casi T. curate 2 medical volumes attributed to Hildegard contained lists of plants, minerals, animal parts, and bodily ailments, remedies, diets, observations, some drawn from scripture, others from experience. She described menstrual cramps with clinical frankness. She recommended cinnamon and fennel for digestion. She discussed how wine affected mood and how cold herbs could balance out fevers. And yet, almost none of this was written down in Hildegard's own hand. That was the first problem. All of her works were dictated spoken aloud to scribes. At first, to her friend and secretary, Volmer. Later, to various monks and priests, some of whom added marginal notes, some of whom silently corrected errors, some of whom quietly changed her phrasing to better align with known authorities. This was how her voice began to shift. And it didn't stop there. By the time her works were copied into formal manuscripts, the Latin had been cleaned up, sentences were reordered, whole passages omitted. Her herbal observations were often altered to remove references to female experience. Dosages were standardized, remedies rewritten. What remained still carried her name, but it no longer sounded like her. Centuries passed. The Renaissance came. With it, a renewed interest in ancient medicine. Male scholars rediscovered Galen, Hippocrates, Avicenna. They built entire systems of diagnosis and treatment from these classical sources and from some of the Latin manuscripts left behind by medieval writers like Hildegard. Except now, she wasn't called a visionary. She was called quaint, a curious relic of medieval thought. Someone who saw stars in the belly and believed the moon could cure coughs. Her more mystical writings were preserved as curiosities, but her medical texts absorbed, dissected, and in many cases erased. Modern scholars have only recently begun to notice the layers, the inconsistencies between early manuscripts and later printings, the missing sections that refer specifically to women's health, the way her ideas were reworded to match Galenic theory even when her original phrasing disagreed. One example in Causae et Cruae. Hildegard originally described a condition involving heaviness of the chest, shortness of breath, and fear in the blood. She linked it to a spiritual imbalance and recommended a mixture of elderberry, warm water, and rest near a running stream. Later editions changed this to a Galenic pulmonary disorder, linked it to phlegm, and recommended bloodletting and bed rest indoors. Which version do you think was cited by university physicians in the 17th century? Another example, Hildegard once noted that the scent of lavender oil could reduce the tension of womb fear, a term she used to describe a blend of anxiety and sorrow in women who had recently miscarried. The phrase was removed from later copies, replaced with feminine melancholy. The remedy lavender was kept. The woman's grief was not. Her visions, too, were reframed. No longer warnings or insights from divine inspiration. They became allegories, symbols, poetic metaphors, safer that way. One wonders what Hildegard would have thought. Would she have been angry? Or would she have seen it coming? After all, she lived long enough to see her own work praised and misunderstood in equal measure. She died at the age of 81, an astonishing age for the time. Her final years were spent fighting with church officials over burial rights for one of her nuns, whose excommunication had not yet been lifted. They told her she could not be buried on convent grounds. Hildegard buried her anyway, and when questioned, she answered not with anger, but with detail. She wrote down why the nun had repented. She described her final breath. She spoke of her eyes, how they cleared at the end, how she smiled. It was not theology, it was observation, like everything Hildegard had ever done. It was quiet, firm, and clear. She saw what she saw, and she wrote it down. But the question still lingers, how much of her truth remains in the words that bear her name? Asterisk, the manuscripts sat on cool stone shelves. Some were copied in red ink, some in black, and a few were decorated with strange vines curling through the margins. They smelled of dust and beeswax, the scent of long vanished candlelight, the weight of centuries heavy on every page. These were the copies of Hildegard's works. Key, but not all of them, spoke with her voice. Many were copied decades after her death, first in Benedictine scriptoria, later in Franciscan libraries, and eventually in the secular workshops of early printers. And in each version, Hildegard changed just a little. Not because she was wrong, but because the men who wrote her down weren't always listening. Take, for example, her discussion of the humors. Hildegard did not reject the four-humor theory outright. She had grown up with it, just as every healer did in her time, but she reimagined it. She connected the humors not just to fluids, but to light, seasons, personality, and sin. She said that too much yellow bile could lead not only to anger, but to spiritual restlessness. She described how women's humoral balances shifted after childbirth, not due to weakness, but because the body turns its heat inward toward repair. These ideas were soft. They didn't speak the language of Galen or Avicenna. They spoke of observation and connection, warm kitchens and winter winds. They didn't belong to the cold stone of a university lecture hall till they were softened. Later, scribes replaced spiritual restlessness with irritability. They removed entire sentences, linking womb heat to grief. Tia, they kept the remedies parsley, warming herbs, lavender, and linen satchels, but stripped the context. What was left sounded more like a man, and that was the point. During the 13th and 14th centuries, universities flourished in cities like Paris, Bologna, and Padua. The field of medicine began to solidify into a formal male profession. Women, previously central to healing, especially in domestic and monastic settings, were increasingly pushed out. Knowledge wasn't enough. Now you needed Latin. Now you needed a university degree, a bishop's blessing, license to diagnose. Hildegard had neither. She was, by the standards of these new scholars, a visionary useful for inspiration, not information. And yet, ironically, was her information they needed most. Monks and physicians quietly combed through her medical texts, searching for herbal remedies, lists of plant properties, and observations on fever patterns and wound care. They copied her words without citation. They inserted her recommendations into broader treatises attributed to male doctors. They stripped out references to gendered pain, especially anything involving menstruation, childbirth, or sexual trauma. Pain that came from the womb was renamed wandering womb syndrome, a mysterious diagnosis that blamed female discomfort on a displaced uterus rather than on grief, cold exposure, or loss. All things Hildegard had carefully described. In this way, her voice became medicalized, encoded. The warmth of her tone was replaced with distance. The specificity of her examples was gone. And slowly, the woman who wrote of divine light and kidney stones in the same sentence was turned into a symbol of quaint, medieval thought. But her real work still whispered from the margins in a little-known copy of Casi et Cure, stored in the monastery of Sweetfelton. A single scribe had made a note in the margin. Beside a passage on digestive imbalance, Hildegard had written, "A sourness may rise in the stomach when a person eats too soon after sorrow." The scribe crossed it out and replaced it with, "Sourness arises from excess moisture in the gut." But in the margin, almost invisible, another hand had written, "The original may also be true. We don't know who wrote that. It might have been another monk. T might have been a woman, one of the anonymous scribes occasionally permitted to copy documents in silence. T, it might have been no one of consequence, but the comment survives. So does the contradiction, and therein lies the strange endurance of Hildegard von Bingen. She was both visionary and empiricist, a woman who claimed to hear God and also described the properties of wild thyme with the precision of a botanist, A nun who obeyed church hierarchy until she didn't. A healer whose ideas were revered enough to be preserved and feared enough to be altered. Even her visions were changed. In her original descriptions, the light she saw was not gentle. It was overwhelming, sometimes frightening, a blaze that poured into her mind like a furnace. She wrote of colors so intense they made her hands tremble. But in later retellings, especially those printed during the Reformation, her visions became sanitized. The light was described as peaceful, calming. Heretical ideas were either removed or rendered metaphorical. They called her an example of holy female silence. They did not mention that she once wrote a letter to the Pope, telling him to listen better. They did not mention her excommunications, her refusals, her fierce protection of the women under her care, and they certainly did not preserve her original tone. Yet somehow, in the folds of vellum, in the crooked lines of lesser-known manuscripts, her real voice still echoes. She speaks of warmth, of herbal poultices for aching joints, how music can cleanse the soul like wind passing over water. How a woman's body is a landscape changing with seasons. Light, grief, and joy. Modern scholars now wrestle with this duality. They call her the mother of German botany. They call her the first female composer. They call her a mystic. They call her an early natural scientist. But they do not agree on who she truly was, because so many versions of her survive. The question remains not what did Hildegard write, but how much of what we read today is still hers, and how many of her observations still lie uncited in the bones of modern medicine. She died in 1179. Hildegard von Bingen passed away in the convent she founded under Rupertsberg, overlooking the Rhine, surrounded by nuns, and likely unaware that within a few generations her words would be untied from her voice. There was no grand procession. No bells rang outside the cloister. The church did not immediately canonize her. In fact, her official sainthood wouldn't come for over 800 years. And yet, in the years following her death, something strange happened. Not silence, but multiplication. Her writings, medical, musical, spiritual, were copied across Europe. Rapidly, not uniformly, but steadily. Pieces appeared in monastery libraries in northern Italy, in obscure herbal texts in England, in spiritual treatises in France. Her name sometimes appeared as Hildegardis, sometimes as the nun of Bingen, and sometimes not at all, in Prague. One manuscript lists a series of remedies for fever that match Hildegard's Physica almost exactly, but attributes them to an unnamed herbarius from Germany. In Florence, a Latin collection of medical aphorisms includes her description of lung complaints caused by cold winds after sorrow, but describes the writer only as an unknown Saxon. She was there, and not there, present in the remedies, missing from the attributions. Meanwhile, male physicians began repackaging her ideas. A 13th century French doctor named Bernard de Gorton included several of her herbal combinations in his Lilia Medicinea, widely cited medical text across Europe. He did not reference her. A German monastic physician described a cure for melancholy involving cooked turnip, wine, and fenelon, exact combination from Hildegard's Physica. He called it a traditional northern remedy. Even as her identity faded, her remedies endured. And yet, the versions that lasted into the printed age were not hers. They were filtered, Latinized, systematized. Her nuanced view of health, where sorrow could sour the liver and joy could warm the spleen, was too complex, too poetic. It's rooted in female experience to survive intact. Her accounts of women's ailments were especially vulnerable in early manuscript versions of Cure. There are entire sections dedicated to childbirth, menopause, womb grief, a term Hildegard used to describe the spiritual and physical toll of miscarriage or child loss. These passages are personal, detailed, and grounded in both observation and mysticism. They blend bodily pain with emotional memory. They offer not just treatments, but comfort. But in the printed editions of the 16th and 17th centuries, these passages were quietly removed, sometimes condensed to a line, sometimes omitted entirely. Printers focused on what sold, and what sold was male anatomy, surgical tools, bleeding charts, and dosage conversions. Hildegard's fluid, atmospheric language did not fit. Neither did her patient-centered approach, so her texts were cleaned by the Enlightenment. She was barely mentioned. She would not re-emerge until the 20th century, not in medical schools, but in archives. It began quietly. A few researchers in Germany stumbled upon odd medical manuscripts attributed to Hildegard von Bingen. At first, they assumed she was a scribe, or perhaps a symbolic name used to give a manuscript legitimacy. But the style was consistent, the metaphors were familiar, and the handwriting, say, in some copies, especially those found near former Benedictine monasteries, matched scribes known to have worked under her. Slowly, scholars began to realize the scope. She hadn't just written music or visions. She had written a body-centered, emotionally aware, deeply empirical form of healing. And she had done it centuries before women were allowed to study medicine in Europe. By the 1980s, Hildegard was embraced by multiple disciplines at once. 2 musicians. She was an early composer. 2 feminists, a proto-medical theorist. 2 mystics, saint. 2 botanists, a chronicler of medieval herbal knowledge. But 2 historians remained a question, because even with new discoveries, gaps remain. The original manuscripts of Physica and Cassi et Cure are missing. What we have are early copies, some more faithful than others. Some scholars believe Cassi et Cure was written mostly by her. Others suspect her scribes may have compiled her teachings with material from other sources. A few argue that the text may have been edited long after her death to bring it in line with dominant medical theories. And yet, the tone is unmistakable, even in translation, even with alterations, even buried beneath layers of Latin formality. There's something undeniably personal in her texts. She doesn't just describe ailments, she describes people. A woman who sits with her sadness in her belly, a man whose cough rattles with the voice of withheld tears, a child whose fever lifts after the warmth of a song. These are not clinical notes, they are portraits. No other medical writer of the 12th century spoke this way, and maybe that's why she was rewritten, not because she lacked authority, but because her authority was too strange, too embodied, too female, so they translated her work, they reorganized it, they flattened her metaphors into definitions. They removed the voice that had once written of light as a kind of knowledge, and of healing as a way of listening to the body's sorrow. And yet, somehow her voice survived. Today, if you open a well-worn herbal from the 14th century and find a note about using fennel to wake the liver after a long sleep, you may be reading Hildegard. If you sip a tea for anxiety and see that it contains lavender and savory, her favorites, you may be tasting what she once scribed. And if you sit beside a river and feel that the air's right for healing, you may be remembering something she wrote, even if you never knew her name. Because sometimes the words we need aren't loud. They arrive like a vision, soft, bright, and almost lost. Asterisk, she was not a witch, at least, not until someone needed her to be, in the year 1575. In the Franconian city of Wurzburg, nestled in the Holy Roman Empires, patchwork of Catholic and Protestant borders, a widow named Elsa. Grabe lived in a narrow, timbered house behind the Church of St. Mary. She did not go to Mass regularly. She did not speak much to the neighbors, and she never remarried. But she kept a cabinet, a large, oiled walnut cabinet with carved floral inlays and iron hinges, said to have belonged to her late husband, who had once worked as an assistant apothecary for the bishop's household. The cabinet had drawers, and in those drawers were dried things, roots wrapped in muslin, dried orange peels stacked like coins, slips of cloth marked in old Latin, resin, dust, tiny bottles sealed with wax, a small knife. She did not call it a shop. She did not advertise. But if you knocked on her back door and waited, she would open it and listen to your complaint. She rarely spoke first. Most people came with problems that physicians wouldn't solve. Rashes that came and went. Weak knees. A daughter who fainted every new moon. A husband whose sleep had turned violent. Elsa would listen, then nod, then disappear into the back room. She never explained what was in her mixtures. She gave instructions. Plainly, drink this before the sun comes up. Boil this with milk. Bury this near water. Sleep with this in your left palm. Most followed her instructions because they worked. Not always, but often enough to matter. She asked for no coin, only bread or eggs, or once a woven shawl. For years, no one questioned her. Not the church, not the guilds, not even the apothecaries. She was a widow, and widows were often tolerated at the edges of practice, especially when they kept to their lanes and didn't challenge male authority. But then came the summer when the bishop's physician fell ill. His name was Conrad Bickler. He was not a cruel man, but he was proud, trained in Padua, educated, fluent in Latin and Greek. He had recently taken to writing a book on miasmatic afflictions of the nervous humor, which he believed would bring him honor across the empire. Then came the shaking. His hands trembled. His vision blurred. He complained of pressure in the back of his skull and sudden waves of nausea. He tried his own remedies, bleeding, vinegar, compresses, tinctures of rose and honey, but nothing helped. He withdrew from his duties and sent for aid. None of the licensed physicians would treat a rival. So, in desperation, his housekeeper visited Elsa. She arrived at dusk, cloaked and silent, and whispered her request through the door. Elsa refused, not out of malice, but because she knew the rules. Helping a commoner was tolerated. Helping a powerful Maenad, curing him meant being noticed. But the housekeeper begged, and Elsa relented. Asterisk. She sent a tonic of valerian, betony, and dried blackthorn flower, soaked in goat's milk, to be sipped warm before sleep. She included strict instructions: no meat, no wine, and no candlelight past nightfall. Within 5 days, the tremors eased by. The second week, the physician was seen walking along the bishop's courtyard again. He did not thank her. Instead, he sent for her notes. She refused again. This time, silence afterward was not peaceful. 2 weeks later, the apothecaries guild filed a complaint with the city magistrate. Not a formal charge, just a concern that Elsa was distributing unregulated compounds, that she was treating nervous disorders without training, that she was storing ingredients not approved by the guild. The church received the complaint and filed it away, quietly for the time being. But then came a second event. A child sick for weeks with a persistent cough recovered after being given a powder Elsa had mixed from dried licorice root, thyme, and small amounts of sulfur. The parents boasted of a miracle in the town square. They even mentioned the little cabinet. The local priest heard, and soon so did the bishop. Within a month, Elsa Grabe was summoned. The court did not call it an inquisition. It was simply an examination. She was asked to describe her training. She said she had none, only what her husband had shown her, and what her mother had shown him. They asked her to list her ingredients. She listed 10. There were over 60 in the cabinet. They asked if she kept Latin texts. She said no. They searched her home anyway. They found no grimoires, no curses, no diagrams of the moon, only paper slips labeled with conditions: for cholera, for dreams, for cramping in winter, for after the 5th bleeding. They found dried herbs strung above the hearth. They found a small bowl of dried rosemary, a feather, and a stone. The bishop's assistant called it a charm. Elsa said it was for drying sweat from the palms. They didn't believe her, but they didn't move quickly either, because here was the problem. Too many people supported her: bakers, fishermen, a widow whose son had survived fever, a young deacon whose cough she had eased with warm broth and crushed quince bark. None of them had authority, but they had voices. They spoke, so the church hesitated. They placed Elsa under temporary house arrest. They ordered the cabinet seized and its contents reviewed by the guild. The guild removed what they recognized, returned what they didn't. The physician who had recovered said nothing. The people watched, and then, one morning, the cabinet was returned, empty. No explanation, no apology. It's placed outside her door. She never opened it again. She began baking. Instead, quietly, she no longer answered knocks after dark. The herbs dried in silence. The house smelled less of mint, more of flour. But in the market, someone noticed that Elsa had begun wrapping loaves in paper with writing. Not all of it legible, but some words familiar. Time for shaking, sweet clover in warm wine, for cramping in winter. No one said anything, but the baker's boy collected those scraps. Did everyone? What happened to them? No one knows, but rumors persist that somewhere in the archives of the Würzburg Diocesan Library, there's a stack of paper loaves, uncatalogued, untranslated, and one of them folded 4 times over bears the faint words, "For men who forget who helped them." Asterisk, in the years following her brief arrest. Elsa Grabe walked slower. She began rising earlier, too long before the bells of St. Mary's tolled, before the city stirred. She would sweep the front of her little house, rinse a few clay jars in the well, and sit at the wooden bench beneath her shuttered window. She no longer answered questions about herbs, but people still came. They didn't call her a healer anymore. They called her the widow, or that woman behind the church, or sometimes just her. The name Elsa was said quietly, like a faded stamp on an old envelope, recognizable only by those who had once needed her. What changed wasn't the remedies, it was the paperwork. After Elsa's cabinet was emptied and returned, the local apothecaries began expanding their official inventory. In their ledgers, new entries appeared: powdered licorice root for coughs, dried orange peel for digestion, betony for tremors, goat's milk, infusions for stomach ailments. The formulas matched Elsa's mixtures almost exactly, but her name was never mentioned. Instead, the guild credited their expanded study of folk treatment in rural areas. They referred to common wisdom and long-standing domestic knowledge, and, occasionally, simply traditional methods. Elsa had been absorbed, not formally, not by invitation, but by quiet theft. It wasn't uncommon in the 16th century. Male apothecaries and physicians were increasingly pressured to show mastery not only of classical medicine, but of vernacular knowledge. That meant pulling remedies from the oral traditions of women wives, widows, midwives, herbalists, and presenting them as rediscovered. To do this, they needed to gather. Without giving credit, a popular technique was clerical transcription. A monk or assistant would interview women about how they used herbs under the guise of curiosity or confession, and then summarize their words into Latin, but the voice changed in the process. Boil the root gently at night and speak kindly to the patient became administered decoction once daily. Don't use this after the moon has waned became contraindicated during the 3rd phase. The body disappeared. So did the voice. Elsa's old notes, if they survived, would have been unfit for publication. Her handwriting was rough, Germanic, uneven. Her spelling shifted depending on the day. She had no access to the fancy iron gall ink used by official scribes. She wrote in soot and rosewater and goat's milk, but she kept writing. She no longer trusted paper, so she began writing on linen, old cloth scraps, corners of flour sacks, the inside seams of pillowcases, tiny, cramped lines that no one would bother unpicking. She gave some away, slipped others into baskets, sewed others into her own hymns, and when asked why she did it, she once told a visiting merchant's wife, because no one burns the laundry. Meanwhile, physicians in Wurzburg were gaining status, medical practice. Once the realm of a few licensed men was becoming increasingly professionalized. Guilds issued tests. The church required oaths. Apprenticeships were extended. The number of women permitted to treat ailments, even unofficially, shrank. The same year Elsa turned 60. A new law was passed. It forbade unauthorized medical interference by lay persons, a phrase so broad it included everything from setting a bone to suggesting a hot bath. The penalty was minor for men, a fine, sometimes a suspension. For women, it could be charges of maleficium. Witchcraft. Elsa had no daughters, no students, no formal apprentices, but she had watchers. A boy named Jacob, who lived across the alley, was said to have copied her little drawings in chalk behind his home. Kay Gross's wife, who once had a stillbirth, kept a folded square of Elsa's fabric in her apron for 20 years. And a nun from a convent outside the city was seen carrying away a bundle wrapped in dark cloth. No one stopped her. Then, during the summer of 1580, Elsa's house caught fire. It started in the hearth. The city guards said it looked accidental. Old thatch, 2 dry beams. Tay pulled her out in time. Her legs were badly burned, and her hair never grew back fully after that. The cabinet, strangely, was untouched. The fire had stopped just short of it. People whispered that perhaps the contents were protected. The guards whispered that perhaps they were responsible. Elsa never said either. Way after the fire, she moved into a small upper room in the bakery near the Bishop's Square. The baker's wife, who had once received a salve from Elsa that saved her eyesight after childbirth, offered her the space without asking for payment. Elsa accepted. She stopped baking, stopped sweeping, but every now and then she still wrapped loaves in paper with words, not recipes, not remedies, just reminders. Wormwood is bitter, but ease is doubt. Boil slowly. Most things burn when rushed. The body tells the truth if you stop trying to fix it. No one accused her again. By the time she died, sometime in late autumn, the town barely noticed. A quiet burial, a pauper's lot, a note in the city registry that simply read, Elsa, widow, formerly of the herb district, deceased of age. But her note survived, not in one place, not as a book, but in the corners of quilts, in bakery ledgers with smudged corners, in a cloth scrap found tucked inside a 17th century herbal, now housed in Vienna, with the faded phrase, clover to clear the chest, and parsley if the words won't come. The author is listed as unknown, but someone, in red ink, has added a marginal note beside the phrase, this sounds like her. The apothecaries of Wurzburg liked things labeled neatly in Latin, behind glass. By the early 1600s, their shops had become more than places of healing. They were part of the city's image. A gentleman might not know how to prepare a tincture, but he could list the virtues of camphor and quote Galen's opinion on saffron. Rows of jars lined the walls of these new establishments. Cinnamon, cloves, juniper berries, cardamom, everything imported, everything exotic, everything controlled. What the guilds hated were smells that didn't belong to them. And Elsa Grabe's herbs, even long after her death, had a smell the guild could not replicate. They tried. They copied her mixtures, adopted her ratios, but the old women said it still wasn't right. The teas came out bitter. The ointments too watery. The results, unpredictable. It's not the herbs, one butcher's wife reportedly muttered in 1604. It's the hands. But hands, unlike jars, could not be cataloged. That was the problem. Knowledge, once in the hands of women like Elsa, was becoming paperwork. Once local, seasonal, personal, it was now printed in Latin manuals, governed by licensing boards and stripped of context. Even the church's understanding of healing shifted. Once content with lay folks treating colds and cramps, the clergy began pushing for more formality, more hierarchy, more oversight. It was no longer enough to know how to make someone better. You had to be seen doing it the right way, preferably with men watching. And yet, Elsa's scraps continued to appear in 1623. A minor cleric in Würzburg noted in his diary the sudden popularity of linen sachets filled with herbs stitched into women's bodices, especially among the midwives. He said they were passed between women in silence and were believed to steady the nerves and ward off ill spirits. He called them superstition, but his wife wore one dot in a convent south of the city. A small archive of female penned medical notes was found, most unsigned, some stained with broth, others written in a strange mix of Old German and rhymed phrases. One included a line about shaking bones soothed by wine and lemon balm, a phrase that matches Elsa's known mixtures almost exactly. The document is preserved in a folder labeled Anonymous Folk Remedies, 17th C, but next to it, in pencil, a modern historian wrote, "These are more sophisticated than they pretend to be." Indeed, because Elsa had never pretended. She never claimed to be a doctor, or a visionary, or a mystic. She listened, she observed, she measured with her fingertips and adjusted by scent. She learned by accident and remembered through trial. Her knowledge was not mystical. It was material, tactile, humble, and that made it threatening, because it could not be transferred to parchment without something going missing. Elsa's greatest threat was not that her herbs worked, but that they worked outside the system, outside the guild, outside the priesthood, outside the Latin. And so she was tolerated until she wasn't. Burning her would have drawn too much attention, but quietly silencing her, emptying her cabinet, and absorbing her wisdom under new names, that was safer. That was bureaucracy's magic. In 1681, a physician named Johann Krugmer published a book titled Medicinal Domestica, Practical Remedies for the Household. Inside were dozens of recipes eerily similar to Lesse's mixtures. The book was celebrated for its accessibility and compassionate approach. Krugmer never mentioned where he got his information, but in one recipe for a winter cough, syrup of anise, honey, and lemon rind, he included a strange line: best if taken before speaking ill of the hand that heals. No one noticed it then, but in 1993, a scholar working through marginalia in a copy of Medicinal Domestica found an odd notation beside that very line. Faint, but readable, from E.G. Elsa Grabe, a woman burned only in reputation, a woman whose tools were seized, whose recipes were taken, whose name was filed under miscellaneous and then quietly lost. And yet her presence endures in the scent of crushed mint in a linen drawer, in the comfort of warm milk after nightfall, in the hidden spaces women still make to pass along knowledge not meant for citation, because Elsa didn't ask to be remembered. She just wanted to write things down, not for praise, but so someone else could breathe easier, so someone else could feel the chest loosen or the dream lighten or the trembling stop. And maybe, just maybe, that's why they feared her, not because she was dangerous, but because she made healing ordinary, and because she reminded them, not all power wants credit. London was quiet in the spring of 1665, not peacefully quiet. The air was wrong. Silence had corners in it, sharp and listening. Birds still chirped, carriages still clattered, but the city itself felt like it was holding its breath. Some said the heat came too early that year, that the Thames smelled more like rot than water, that the fog didn't lift from alleyways, even after noon. And in the poorer districts, St. Giles, Whitechapel, Southwark, something else lingered in the streets, a smell no one could name. Not yet. The plague arrived the way it always did, with denial. Merchants said it was nothing, just summer fever. The city's physicians, those who hadn't fled to their country estates, reassured clients that it was under control. The mayors, men ordered quarantine of individual homes, but not the ports. Not yet. The city couldn't afford to close, so the women stayed. Not because they weren't afraid, but because they had nowhere else to go. The wealthiest men fled, first physicians. Among them, doctors with powdered wigs and university degrees. Men who had studied Hippocrates and scribbled notes in Latin during dissections quickly disappeared to rented houses in the country. They left behind the city's body, and in that body, women moved quietly between homes. They were called searchers. It was not an official title, at least not one any woman would want. Searchers were poor, older, often widows, sometimes barely literate. They were tasked with inspecting the dead and declaring the cause of death. For this, they were paid a few shillings by the parish. Sometimes they were paid in candles. These women were not medical professionals, but they knew what plague looked like. They had seen the black swellings, buboes along the groin or armpits. They could smell the sickness before entering a room. They knew the difference between fever from grief and fever from death. They also knew the risks. Many died within weeks of their first assignments, but some lived. They lived because they boiled their linens, because they burned rosemary in small dishes near windows, because they chewed angelica root, because they believed in vinegar, fresh air, and not sitting too close to a corpse. None of this was written in medical books. It was passed between women, at doorways, in alleys, during washing, quietly. But searchers weren't the only ones who stayed. So did the midwives. So did the herb sellers, the washerwomen, and the mothers who had no one else to care for their children. In plague time, the border between healer and neighbor blurred. A woman who had once sold herbs in the market now applied onion poultices to her sister's swollen throat. A young girl whose mother had dyed mixed mustard paste for an old man's cough. Midwives repurposed their tool swaddles, became face coverings. Birthing stools became sick beds. And while the male physicians debated whether the plague was divine punishment or caused by ill humors, women were already boiling water. The city's official records tell very little about them. There are no heroic paintings, no statues, no formal thank you from the king. But in the marginal notes of burial rolls, you find their traces. Widow Anne, who cared for the Carter children before her passing. Bridget, midwife, buried with her apron still damp. And herbalist, known to the parish, placed rosemary beneath all windows. These aren't biographies. They're shadows. But shadows fall where people once stood. There's one record, kept by a parish scribe in Stepney, that tells of a house with 5 children, all orphaned. The neighbors fled. The constable nailed shut the front door. But the next day, someone had removed the nails. Inside, the children were alive, fed, blankets washed. The youngest had chamomile paste on his skin. No, one admitted to entering the house. The scribe called it a mystery of kindness. It was not a mystery. It was a woman. Somewhere in the tangle of narrow streets, a woman had entered a plague house alone, not for coin, not for recognition, but because someone had to. And this happened more than once in the weeks that followed. More doors were opened, quietly, from the inside. Blankets left folded. Water boiled and leapt on thresholds. Fever broken, and yet When the plague finally passed, when London buried its last swollen body, the names that filled the official histories were not the names of those who had stayed. They were the men who had returned, doctors who re-entered the city with books of observations, who wrote pamphlets about the nature of the disease, who lectured on quarantine and treatment. And in those pamphlets, you will not find the word searcher, you will not find the word washerwoman or herb seller or widow or midwife who stayed when the doctors ran. Instead, you will find phrases like ... anomalous recoveries reported in the lower quarters ... possible intervention by local caregivers of undetermined training ... double quotes ... instances of folk remedy noted, but lacking scientific validation, even now in modern histories. The male doctors of the plague are credited with observation, classification, diagnosis, but the women, their role is often footnoted, crossed, and yet they were the ones who opened the doors, who wrapped the sick in linen, who whispered comfort in the fever dark, and scraped together tea from onion skins and dried leaves. Their work was not theoretical, wet, it was heavy, it was real, and it was dangerous. What remains is not a plaque or a title, it's a practice, still taught in some households, still whispered in some families, not as plague medicine, but as instinct. Open the window, boil the water, but don't wait for the doctor. Help if no one else will. And still, no one knows how many lives were saved, or how many were quietly buried without ever being named. Only this question remains: who heals a city when its physicians are gone? By midsummer of 1665, bells had stopped ringing for every death. There were too many. London's air thickened with smoke from the constant fires meant to purify the streets. Every alleyway seemed to hold a cart, every cart a body. The rich had vanished behind iron gates in country estates, the poor left behind in the parishes of Limehouse, Bethnal Green, and Shoreditch relied not on medicine, but on survival, and survival often arrived in skirts done on records from the parish of St. Olavi. One line appears repeatedly beside death. Entries was cared for before passing. No name, no title, just that sometimes beside the name of a child, left clean and quiet. These aren't medical notations, they're social memory, because during the plague, care became an act of resistance. It wasn't sterile. There were no rubber gloves. There were no disinfectants beyond vinegar, fire, what people called God's breath, the summer wind. But the women who stayed developed patterns: boil linen every 2 days, keep windows open even when the smell from the street is unbearable, burn sage in the corners, wrap the dead in soaked cloth to weigh down the breath. Don't cry too loudly, it weakens the chest. None of these rules appear in medical treatises from the time, yet they spread like wind among the women of the parishes. Many of them had no written language for what they knew. They measured by handfuls and pinches, by the way a room felt, by the way a fevered hand trembled just before it cooled. They could not explain what rosemary did to a room, but they knew it had to be burned slowly, not snapped. They could not quantify the calming effects of lavender, but they slipped it into bed straw when they sensed the dreams were dark. To the men who returned later, scribes, doctors, and historians, this wasn't medicine. It was superstition. But superstition, unlike theory, was functional. It didn't require approval. It only required memory, and women remembered. They remembered that babies didn't cry when garlic was hung at the window, that bruises shrank faster with crushed ivy, that a vinegar-soaked rag over the nose slowed the smell of decay. They didn't explain. They practiced it in one surviving note from a midwife's household inventory, scrawled in the margin of a grocery list. We find more rosewater, burned through last batch. Better results when boiled with lemon rind. Use only at dusk. Results, not theories. These notes, folded among receipts, and birth announcements were the records the official books never asked for, and while the physicians debated the best method for lancing buboes, the women had already moved on to comfort. What good was bleeding a man who couldn't drink water? They prepared barley gruel, laced with mint. They kept buckets of cool water near bedsides. They sang, not for piety, but to steady a room's breath. And when their patients died, they closed the eyes gently, bound the mouth, burned the bedding. No ceremony, no Latin, only care. Still, some physicians remained. A few brave or desperate male doctors did stay in the city. Their observations, published later in neat volumes, referenced remarkable recoveries in impoverished homes. Some even admitted that non-professionals, mostly women, seemed to intuit the illness's timing better than our instruments. But none of them named names. One, a Dr. Thomas Greaves, noted that a particular woman in Southern had evident skill in observing the fever's rhythm. He called her the matron and said she had saved several children through simple, herbal infusion and strict quiet. Her real name was Margaret Finns. She was 60 years old, a widow. She had previously worked in a butcher shop. No formal training, but she buried more patients properly than the parish hospital did that summer. Her name does not appear in any of the books. Only in a side note, on a page corner in Dr. Greaves' personal diary. Matron Margaret would trust her judgment over mine. That judgment was not learned in books. It was learned in the smell of a dying room, in the change of breathing, in the way skin stiffens an hour before death. And while she was doing this, boiling linens, mixing root teas, holding the wrists of strangers, others were writing theories. A physician in Cambridge suggested that plague came from bad air disturbed by the rotation of the planets. Another posited that it was the movement of subterranean vapors. Another blamed it on the diet of the poor. But the women in the alleys knew better. They knew it came in the quiet, in the rattle of the chest, in the stillness of sleep that did not break. They didn't name it. They didn't explain it. They responded to it, quickly, gently, with cloth and water, in calm. And when the city began to recover, when the plague carts stopped rolling and the churches reopened, the women didn't ask for thanks. They asked for soap, for clean straw, for quieter streets. They were given none of those things. They were told to return to their proper places, to forget what they had seen, what they had done. But some didn't forget. Some wrote. A few left notes in the backs of cookbooks. Others stitched lines into blankets. One left a bundle of rosemary, dried orange peel, and camphor in the corner of her garden, wrapped in paper, labeled only for the next time, because they knew this wasn't the last plague. It was just the latest one that men would forget, until it was useful to remember. And even then, the credit would go elsewhere. Asterisk. When the Great Plague finally eased in early 1666, the tally stood at nearly 100,000 dead. The number was likely higher. The official ledgers, kept by parish clerks and hurried scribes, had wide margins and blank lines. Not every alley was counted. Not every death was written. But those who remained knew what had been lost and who had helped. They remembered the women who had stayed when others fled. The women who didn't wait for permission, who boiled water before the priests gave last rites, who wrapped the dead without prayers, but with clean hands, and who whispered comfort even when there were no more remedies left. But as the city repaired itself, their stories faded. Quickly. The streets were cleaned, the city walls whitewashed, trade resumed. Plague pamphlets rolled off the presses, most written by men who had fled and returned. They told of the disease's spread, its symptoms, and sometimes its causes. But rarely did they mention care, and never did they name the women who had given it. Instead, the publications focused on the visible, on statistics, on theories, on the streets where the death toll was highest. They described peculiar instances of survival and spontaneous recoveries, but rarely credited those who had stirred the broth, wiped the brows, or turned the dying gently onto their sides so they could breathe easier. The Great Fire of London came months later. It scorched the city into ash and smoke, burned over 13,000 homes, cleansed the remaining filth, as some claimed, and with it, it burned paper ledgers, diaries, notes. Some historians believe entire parish records were lost. Others believe they were simply never kept in the first place, but the knowledge didn't burn. It moved. It passed from mother to daughter, from neighbor to widow, from midwife to apprentice, whispered in kitchens, stored in bundles of cloth, tucked into the lining of sleeves. One herbalist in the early 1700s, writing from a town outside London, described a remedy she learned not from books, but from a woman who had lived through the old sickness in London. Remedy: burnt rosemary, mixed with cooled rainwater, strained through linen, and sipped at dusk to steady the shaking. There is no way to prove it came from 1665, but the shape of the method simple, soothing, made with what was near matches. What we know of the care given during the plague, the kind of care never written in Latin, and that's what makes this story part of a larger silence, because what women did during the plague, how they held the dying, soothed the sick, protected the living, was not seen as intellectual work. It was survival work, and survival, unlike diagnosis, does not always leave citations. Still, traces remain. In 1724, a physician named John Arbuthnot wrote a brief paper about folk persistence in times of pax and fever. He expressed surprise that rural women continued to use mixtures nearly identical to those recorded during the Great Plague. He called them lingering errors. But he also noted that in one London household, all 5 children had survived smallpox while the neighboring family lost 3. The only difference: their grandmother had boiled lemon balm in the house for a week before symptoms began. Arbuthnot dismissed it as coincidence, but the old woman didn't. She said she learned it from a midwife who stayed when the others left. That phrase, repeated quietly through the years, has become a refrain for what was lost and for what endures, because the women who stayed didn't ask to be remembered. They didn't write books, didn't demand titles. They didn't publish pamphlets. They left boiled linens in bundles of dried mint and clean hands. Left knowledge stitched into aprons and sealed inside wooden boxes tucked beneath stairs. The late left silence and survival. And so, the story of the plague is not only about death, it's about the people who didn't run, the ones who opened doors nailed shut, who held the sick when no one else would, who boiled vinegar, not because they believed it would stop the plague, but because it was the only thing they had left. They did what doctors would later take credit for. They did what the records never included, and in doing so, they became something no ledger could record. Necessary. Asterisk. In the quiet hill country of 14th century Auvergne, long before the roads were paved or the borders fixed, there lived a woman named Agnes Lesage. She was not born into the role of healer. She married into it. Her husband, Etienne, was a scribe and local apothecary in a small fortified village east of Clermont. He kept a modest shop, no more than a stone room with shelves of powder, dried flowers, and scrolls that he copied from nearby monasteries. He had been trained by a local Benedictine brother and prided himself on his steady hand. It was Agnes who saw the patients. At first, she was only an assistant. She fetched water, washed linen, cleaned mortar bowls. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, her role shifted. Etienne grew ill with a fever that never fully left him, and Agnes began to mix the tonics. Then she began to take notes. She did not write in Latin. She wrote in French, plain, careful, and precise. She began to organize Etienne's scattered observations into categories: for coughs, for bruises from work, for stomach pains. in women who recently gave birth. And soon, she started adding her own. At first, she labeled them modestly, observed remedy, or heard from a neighbor. But then, she began to write, used and tested, worked after 2 days, no improvement after. Vinegar added remove, next time. Her tone was not mystical. It was measured. She made a kind of book knot, a published work. Not something bound and sanctioned, but a codex of folded pages sewn roughly with red thread. It grew as the years passed. Etienne's handwriting faded. Agnes S. filled the margins. By the time she was 40, she was the one people came to, not because she claimed special knowledge. She never wore the sign of a healer, never burned herbs in public, but she listened, and her answers worked. A child with night terrors, a woman who bled too long after her 3rd child, a farmer with trembling hands during harvest. She did not promise cures. She promised attention, and that was more than most had. One winter, a friar traveling through the region heard of her. He was gathering accounts of folk healing for the church, ostensibly to preserve knowledge, in practice to weed out what the bishops called irregular practitioners. He arrived at Agnes's home without warning. He was polite, inquisitive, said he had heard she kept records, asked if she would share them for the benefit of all. She hesitated. He wore a gray wool robe and had the easy manner of a man used to being obeyed. But his eyes lingered too long on her ink-stained hands. She offered him tea. Then she offered to read aloud from her notes rather than hand them over. He agreed. For 2 evenings, she read from her manuscript. She shared cases, described herbs, talked about patterns she had seen, how damp months brought chest ailments, how overuse of certain oils led to swelling, how elderberry worked best before the full moon. The friar nodded, took notes, said little. Then he left. 2 months later, a summons arrived. Agnes was to appear before a tribunal in Claremont, under suspicion of unauthorized practice of physic and improper recording of spiritual observations. The phrase made no sense. She hadn't recorded spiritual observations. She'd recorded pain, remedies, outcomes, but the implication was clear. Her work was too detailed, too methodical, too much like a physician's, and she was a woman without sanction. Etienne tried to intervene, but by then he was too weak to travel. Agnes went alone. She brought her manuscript at the tribunal. They asked her why she had kept such records, why she had written in the vernacular, why she had not sought approval from the church before attempting healing. She answered plainly, because people were in pain, because Latin was slow, because no one else was writing it down. The room was cold, the scribe's pen scratched. One of the clerics asked to see the manuscript. She handed it over. He did not read it. He passed it to another. By the end of the hearing, the verdict was deferred. A would consult with higher authority. They told her to return home and await a decision. She never saw the manuscript again. 3 weeks later, a messenger brought word that her writings had been confiscated for preservation and review. She was not to continue practicing until further notice. She returned to her village, empty, handed, but not silent, because Agnes remembered every page. And in the weeks that followed, its clue, she began to rewrite it. Not in a bound book this time, but on whatever she could find. Scraps of cloth, bark, the backs of old food ledgers. She gave pieces away to women who had once been her patients. She stitched others into bundles and buried them near her herb plots. Some of them have never been found. Others, just fragments, have surfaced in estate inventories centuries later. It's always unattributed, often mistaken for superstition. A recipe for a clove and rose salve wrapped in old linen. A list of symptoms noted beside the name of a woman who died of childbirth fever. A brief instruction: do not add vinegar after heat. Causes swelling. There is no record of what happened to the original manuscript, no citation, no library claim, but in the archives of Claremont, cataloged entry appears in the year 1342 under the heading, Anonymous Vimini Compendium Herbarum Confiscated. No author is named, but the notes match her language. The friar's handwriting appears in the margins. He has corrected her grammar, crossed out her doses, added the phrase, "This needs clerical oversight," and next to one of her clearest sentences, observed the swelling decrease by dawn. He has written, unverified, ***. The winter that followed Agnes's hearing in Claremont was colder than usual. The snow arrived early, covering the crooked stone roads of her village before the last walnuts had fallen. Smoke clung low in the air, the scent of burning peat and wet wool threading through the narrow passageways. And Agnes, no longer formally permitted to observe the sick, found herself busier than ever, because something peculiar happened when her manuscript was taken away. People trusted her more. She was no longer viewed as part of the system, and perhaps she never had been. She was something different, a person who had risked punishment to write down things that mattered. A woman who had told the truth and been told to stop. So they came in the evening. They didn't knock. They came with fevers, with old injuries that had turned cold in the joints, with children who didn't sleep and couldn't speak. They came with ailments that weren't listed in the official books. Agnes kept her windows closed and her hearth low, but her hands stayed warm. She kept rewriting what she remembered, giving each patient a scrap of parchment with only what was necessary, never the whole context, never the full recipe. In this way, her knowledge dispersed. It didn't vanish. It fractured. There were two types of scribes in the Middle Ages, those who copied what was approved, and those who wrote what had no name. Agnes became the latter, a chronicler of undocumented pain. Meanwhile, the friar who had visited her brother, Guillaume, continued his work. He traveled through towns claiming to collect questionable knowledge for the sake of purity. But what he truly sought were fragments of undocumented healing, often from women. He compiled their findings, stripped them of local dialects, and reorganized them according to Galenic principles. The same measurements, the same humoral theories, the same Latin phrases. By the time he returned to Paris, he had amassed a small but valuable collection of notes, some of which would later appear unattributed in early printed texts on rural medicine. One of the earliest known mentions of an elderflower paste for persistent coughing appears in a 5th century compilation known as the Tractatus de Mulieribus Simplicibus, treatise on the simple remedies of women. But no women are named, only a vague acknowledgement from the customs of the countryside. This was the quiet erasure Agnes became part of, not dramatic, not fiery. There was no public burning, no execution, but her name faded. Her methods, once handwritten in French, were recast in a language meant to gatekeep. And yet, some of her ideas survived, not because they were preserved, but because they were too useful to ignore. Agnes did not stop collecting knowledge. She began to visit places where no clerics would go. Field kitchens during harvest, animal pens, old cemeteries. She spoke to grave diggers, wet nurses, widows. There were stories of boiled lichen used for inflammation, tales of willow bark wrapped around the ankles of men with swelling, recipes that had never been written down, not because they were secret, but because no one had asked. She listened, and then she wrote. But this time, she didn't keep the pages. She distributed them, some to a weaver in Issoire, whose daughter could not carry children to term, others to a traveling merchant whose son suffered fits in winter, still others to the old miller's apprentice whose back had curved after falling into the water wheel pit. None of them kept the scraps neatly. Some used them as bookmarks and psalters. Others folded them into their shoes for luck. A few tucked them into cracks in the walls, in case someone ever came looking. Many of those scraps had been lost to mildew and fire and 4GETFULNESS. But in a hidden corner of the bibliothèque municipale in Clermont-Ferrand, there exists a fragment catalogued only as MFH 1342-221. It is a single page, written in a coarse but steady hand. Not Latin, French. The paper is browned and the ink faded, but three things are legible. For coughs with thick breath, boil elderflowers, crush with honey. Take before dawn. While fasting, do not speak afterward for 1 hour. Swelling returns, do not apply heat. Tested twice. It worked both times. No author's name, but one marginal note in another hand later. Different ink. Latin reads, possibly connected to heretical writings. Source unverified. Agnes never wrote about God. She did not challenge the church. She did not cast spells or summon spirits. She simply wrote down what worked, and for that, she was erased from the record by degrees. But her ideas outlived her silence, because knowledge, when useful, has a strange way of hiding in plain sight. And what could be more useful than healing? Still, questions remain. What else did her original manuscript contain? Were there warnings that were never copied? Remedies now forgotten? Was her refusal to use Latin an act of clarity or defiance? And why did so many men, entrusted with recording the truth, choose instead to take notes and leave out her name? Asterisk. By the time Agnes Lesage was in her 60th year, her eyesight had begun to fade. She no longer made the elderflower paste herself. She taught others. Her hands, once steady enough to stitch up a shepherd's split brow by the light of a tallow candle, now trembled. The cords of age had tightened around her fingers. Good, not her memory. She remembered everything. Which herbs slowed fevers without drying the tongue, which bark soothed stomachs but made the urine burn, which roots cured the thrush in infants, which combinations would help a woman miscarry of. She asked for it without bleeding to death. But these recipes were no longer hers. They belonged to the women she had taught, girls who'd sat beside her in low kitchens and memorized every motion of her hand, the midwives who had started as patients, the widows who had turned to healing because there was nothing else left. Agnes no longer needed to write. Her words had moved into other voices, and yet she often wondered what had happened to the manuscript, the original one. The thick sheaf of pages she had written in her 20s and 30s with the stiff tips of goose feathers she cut herself and sharpened on old knives, the one she had stitched together with linen thread, the one the friar had taken from her home, folded neatly in a leather pouch, as if it were dangerous and sacred at once. Sometimes, in her dreams, she imagined it still existed, not in the hands of an apothecary or a physician, but somewhere forgotten damp corner of a library shelf, waiting to be misfiled into significance. In truth, no one knows what became of the original text. What we do know is this: a century later, in the 1470s, a traveling printer named Etienne Vallon passed through Clermont-Ferrand on his way to Toulouse. He was not an educated man, not in the way university doctors were, but he understood the hunger for local texts, things people would buy. He collected pamphlets, recipes, saint stories, farmers' almanacs. Among the materials attributed to his early press is a booklet called Les Secours des Femmes, Women's Remedies. It is anonymous. It contains no theological preamble, no reference to Galen or Hippocrates, just simple lists. To calm the pain of the belly after loss of child, steep sage and lavender in wine. Drink warm, do not eat after. For a sore mouth in a baby, pass a silver spoon over ash from burned thyme and touch it to the tongue. If milk is bad in the breast, heat flat, stone and press lightly before bed. Several historians dismissed the booklet as folk knowledge, with no scholarly value. Others noted that the handwriting of the original source pages still preserved. In part appeared feminine. In a tiny margin of one page, barely visible, are the words, A.S. made this note. It helped me once, and though we cannot confirm that A.S. stood for Agnes Lesage, the dates align, the ingredients are familiar, and the method of writing plain, direct, without decoration, is consistent with other fragments believed to be hers. It is possible that someone, perhaps even a patient, had memorized her notes, or smuggled a copy, or rewritten it from memory, before it could be lost. What matters is not whether it was her writing. What matters is that her work endured. She was never tried again, never imprisoned. She died in her own bed, wrapped in a rough wool blanket, surrounded by bowls of dried herbs and a shallow basin that still smelled faintly of vinegar and cloves. No priest was called until hours later. Her body was washed by women, the same women who had learned her cures, whispered her methods to their daughters, and passed them quietly from hand to hand, even when paper was scarce and memory was the only ink that would not fade. In this way, Agnes Lesage was never martyred. She was never formally canonized, never painted into the margins of illuminated manuscripts. She became something else, a rumor in recipes, a shadow in books no scholar cited, a scribe whose pen never wrote for fame, but for survival. And isn't that the strangest kind of victory? Not to be remembered by name, but to be remembered in effect. To have her language pulled apart, repackaged, stolen, and yet still used. To have healed a child she never met. To have saved a mother in a village whose name she never learned. To have had her words, if not her story, survived the silence that tried to smother them. We often ask what history remembers, but maybe the better question is, what does it forget on purpose? And what might we find if we looked not in the pages of official books, but in the margins of margins? Asterisk, it began, as so many stories in early modern Italy did, with a scream. Not the scream of a tortured heretic, not the echo of violence from an alleyway, but the ragged animal sound of a woman in labor deep inside a narrow home on the Via del Corso in Modena. The year was 1582, and Antonia de' Carpi had already delivered 7 children that week. She wasn't tired, not yet. Antonia was a midwife, trained not by book, but by blood, by experience, by surviving dozens of deliveries without a single death. In a time when most births involved pain, prayer, and hope in equal measure, she had become known in Modena's poorer quarters for her gentle hands and her silence. She didn't scold the women, didn't gossip afterward, didn't tell husbands if the timing of her birth didn't quite add up. She was small, wrinkled like an olive pit, and always smelled faintly of marjoram and ashdod. She carried 3 things in a sack: a tightly folded cloth of boiled linen, a bone-handled knife she kept sharper than a butcher's, and a scrap of paper with notes in her own jagged hand, recipes, signs to look for, little cures that weren't in any medical book. She had no license, no patron, and no interest in acquiring either. The doctors, of course, hated her, and not just in Modena, across Italy, across Europe even. The late 16th century saw the rise of professional medicine, male, damnated, diversity, certified, and closely watched by church authorities. Childbirth, once the domain of women alone, was slowly being pulled into the realm of scientific oversight. Men who had never seen a live birth were writing treatises. Archbishops were deciding which herbs were too close to witchcraft. Surgeons, who had never held the hand of a screaming mother, were correcting techniques used by women like Antonia for generations. What Antonia knew, what she had learned through the work of her fingers and the quiet sharing of women's knowledge, was suddenly a threat, not because it was false, but because it worked, and she didn't ask permission. Her troubles began with a difficult birth in late spring. A merchant's wife, heavy with her first child, went into labor 3 weeks early. Her husband, eager to appear modern and enlightened, insisted that a male physician be present for the delivery. A young doctor from Ferrara was summoned. He wore leather gloves, spoke in Latin, and sweated through his robes at the sight of blood. Antonia was called only when things began to go wrong. By the time she arrived, the woman had been writhing for hours. The physician had attempted to reposition the baby with a spoon-shaped instrument, tearing the cervix. There was panic in the room. The mother was half delirious. The baby's head was tilted wrong, caught at an angle that could easily have led to both their deaths. Antonia asked for silence. She laid her hands on the mother's belly and closed her eyes. Then she reached in, turned the infant slowly, not with force, but with practiced care, and guided the baby out with the help of gravity, sweat, and murmured prayers. The child lived, so did the mother, and the doctor was humiliated. He did not thank her. He left in silence, blood on his gloves, and returned to Ferrara with a wound to his reputation that stung more than the birthing room's heat. Within a month, rumors had begun to spread. Whispers that Antonia used charms, that she read secret books, that she had herbs capable of bringing labor to or stopping it altogether, that she touched women in ways that only a man should. Understand, the Inquisition didn't knock at her door immediately. They started with the women she had helped. Neighbors were questioned. Midwives were warned. Antonia noticed that some of the younger girls who had shadowed her stopped asking questions. Some left the city altogether. She did not run. Why would she? What had she done that wasn't born of necessity? But in 1583, the trial records show her name Antonia de Carpe, known as La Vecchia dell'Olio, the old woman of the oil. She was not accused of witchcraft at first. The charge was more technical, practicing medicine without license, a convenient way to discipline the unlicensed healers without needing proof of sorcery. Still, everyone knew what the underlying implication was. Women who healed were fine until they were too good, especially if they healed without church approval, especially if they made male physicians look foolish. In court, she refused to name her teachers. She said, "I learned from women older than me. I watched, I listened, I practiced," she said. "There is no license for what I do, only lives saved." She said, "If I have sinned, show me which child I harmed." The court could not, but they could punish her for her independence, and so they did. She was fined, forbidden to practice, ordered not to assist in any future births under threat of imprisonment. Antonia nodded in silence. Then, the next month, when the baker's wife went into labor and the town physician was drunk, she showed up anyway, and once again, both mother and child survived. She had defied the order. But how do you arrest someone for saving lives? By the winter of 1584, her name came up again, this time in connection with miscarriages. Women who lost pregnancies had spoken of a potion given to ease cramping. Some said it had helped them pass the fetus. Others said it simply brought relief from the pain. None of them named Antonia directly, but the implication was there. Midwives were already under suspicion of being abortionists. It was a double bind: blamed when pregnancies failed, feared when they succeeded without medical oversight. Antonia was summoned once more, but this time the trial did not focus on herbal remedies. It asked about her notes. It asked about the paper in her sack. She denied nothing. She simply said, "If the words on that page frighten you, perhaps you feared the wrong thing." The court adjourned. The sack was never returned, and Antonia disappeared from the records after that. No record of death, no grave, no further mention in church logs, only rumors that she fled to Bologna or to the countryside, that she changed her name, that she trained one last girl, a mute orphan, before vanishing completely. What we do know is this: for years afterward, In the poorer districts of Modena, there were women who remembered her, who boiled wine with juniper berries, the way she had shown them, who passed around a single page of her notes, now barely legible with use, who said, quietly, La Vecchia dell'Olio would have known what to do. But what did she write on that page? What knowledge was lost when the ink faded? Asterisk. There are many things a midwife might carry: herbs tied in linen, a charm stitched into the hem of a dress, or a long-forgotten recipe folded into a cracked leather pouch. But for Antonia de Carpe, the most dangerous thing she carried wasn't a root or an oil. It was knowledge. Knowledge of the kind that did not belong to her, at least not according to the men who said they knew better. After the court's warning, Antonia returned home in silence. The order was clear. She was to practice no more. No more attending births, no more healing, no more scribbled notes passed between neighbors like sacred relics. But Antonia had heard that tone before, not in court, but in the mutterings of physicians who feared being shown up. She knew it was not about safety. It was about control. Still, she was careful. She stopped carrying her sack openly. She burned many of her notes, but not all. Some she rewrote from memory late at night. Her hands were slower now. Her knees ached from years of squatting at bedsides and crouching on dirt floors. But the work preserving what she knew was more urgent than ever. She took up a new habit: boiling vinegar with crushed bones, then painting the mixture onto scraps of fabric. When dried, she wrote on the stiffened cloth with a chicken feather, then sewed the strips into the lining of her apron. If her home was searched again, they'd find nothing, but she would not forget what had taken her 40 years to learn. Knowledge passed to her from old Griselda, who taught her to place a coin under a woman's tongue to keep her from biting through it in pain. From Katerina, who'd shown her how to reduce swelling in torn flesh using fennel and milk. From Beatrice, who once whispered, while half drunk on communion wine, "The only thing holier than a birth is a clean cut." Those women were all gone, and soon Antonia feared she would be too. The city had changed. In 1585, a new bishop was appointed to Modena, a young fire-eyed and determined to purge superstition from medicine. He called for a census of all healing women, midwives, herbalists, and widows with knowledge. Those without licenses were to be registered and reviewed. Those who refused would face punishment. Those who were too effective were often labeled dangerous. Antonia's name appeared on the list again, despite the court's prior ruling. But this time, she wasn't summoned. She was watched. 2 novices from the local monastery were assigned to follow her movements. Under the guise of charity work, lingered in corners during baptisms. They questioned families quietly after deliveries. They asked leading questions. Had Antonia used oils? Had she spoken strange words? Had she offered tea before the labor began? What they really wanted was a confession, some sign that she had crossed from medicine into magic in those years. The line between the two was drawn not by science, but by power. A male physician's tincture was medicine, a midwife's was suspicion. Bishop's reach extended beyond Modena. In nearby Reggio and Parma, midwives were already being replaced by birth surgeons in noble houses. Latin text translated awkwardly from Arabic sources became required reading for anyone assisting in childbirth, and of course, texts were only available to men. Antonia had never learned Latin. She didn't need to. She understood blood and breath, and when the baby was turned wrong, or when a woman's body was already saying goodbye, and the mothers trusted her too much, the church thought. One night in spring, she was summoned not to court, but to a stone room beneath the cathedral. No incense, no cross, just a wooden table and a single sheet of parchment with her name on it. "You have been seen," the official said. "Not accused, not tried, seen." They said, she had attended births. They said she had been paid in loaves of bread and eggs, not coin. They said a woman who miscarried last month had spoken of her name before slipping into fevered sleep. Antonia did not deny it. She said, "I do what I must." They handed her another order. Not exile, not prison, silence had. If she practiced against, she so much as assisted with the bandage, she would be charged formally when she left. The city felt smaller. That night, she sat alone with the vinegar strips she had prepared. The ink was fading, the cloth yellowed, but the words held. She traced each one, whispering under her breath to turn the baby clockwise, press above the navel to stop bleeding, use crushed mint and pressure behind the knees. If the mother screams, in silence, speak her name. And then she did something strange. She invited 3 women to her home, women she had helped before. She told them she would not be around much longer, not because she feared death, but because the wind has changed. She gave each of them a bundle, not herbs, not medicine, but knowledge, each cloth strip sewn into the hems of their skirts. If they question you, she said, say it is mending. If they ask who taught you, she said, say no one. The following week, a widow from the countryside arrived in Modena with a breech labor. No physician was available. The woman's sister pleaded at the cathedral steps. Antonia saw her from a distance, heard the cries echo through the street, and she stayed inside. That night, the child died, and the mother followed by mourning. Some said Antonia wept. Others said she merely closed her shutters and lit a single candle. The church praised the situation as a lesson, but others quietly called it a loss, not of life, but of wisdom. There are records, of course, a few vague notes in the bishop's journal, a mention in a physician's complaint ledger, a short line. The old woman of oil remained stubborn, but contained. But her true legacy was not in parchment. It was in the cloth sewn into skirts, in the women who began to whisper her methods under different names, in the jars of crushed root tucked behind flour sacks, in the fact that no one really knew, how much Antonia had shared, or with whom, because knowledge, once passed on, becomes harder to bury than a body. But how many other women like her simply disappeared? And what vast libraries of healing, written not in books, but in practice, were lost one silent room at a time. Asterisk in the years that followed. Antonia de Carpi was spoken of less and less. The officials said she had retired. The church claimed she was no longer a threat. The newer generation of city-trained male surgeons said she had outlived her usefulness. But in back alleys, in the glow of shared kitchens, her name was whispered with a curious mix of reverence and sorrow. No one knew exactly when she died. Some said she passed quietly in her sleep during the winter of 1589. Others claimed she simply left one morning toward the marches outside Modena, never to return. A few believed she was taken discreetly, without record, and buried in unconsecrated ground. There are no parish records of her death, only a final note in the bishop's ledger. Antonia de C. presumed deceased. No further sightings. Case closed. But the story didn't end there, because something else began quietly, gently, beneath the surface. Asterisk, the women she had trained began to visit one another, not openly, not in gatherings that might attract attention, but slowly, in 2s and 3s. They passed along the vinegar-soaked cloths. Kay translated her notes into local dialects, made corrections based on their own experiences, and then they began to copy them by the early 1590s. In a village south of Parma, a peasant girl named Lucretia was said to carry a small packet of these notes in a pouch around her waist. She had never met Antonia, never stepped foot in Modena, but when asked how she knew what to do when a mother began hemorrhaging, she simply said, "It was written on the cloth." Antonia's healing recipes began to appear as marginalia in household prayer books. Between the verses of the Psalms and beside illustrations of saints, one might find, when fever grips the child, rub the feet with garlic and whisper his name 3 times. For pain after birth, place hot stones wrapped in wool beneath the hips. These notes, half prayer and half instruction, came in visible libraries. The church did not know what to do with this kind of resistance. It was not rebellion in the streets. It was not heretical writings nailed to cathedral doors. It was something smaller, something harder to crush. In 1604, a Jesuit missionary traveling through Emilia-Romagna wrote in his journal, "The women here speak often of old methods rituals tied to saints, but unfamiliar to Scripture. One named Antonia is invoked like a matron saint of birth. No such saint exists." By then, the men had returned to childbirth. The formal practice of midwifery had been absorbed into medicine. Male surgeons used forceps. They read from printed manuals. They wore gloves when they could afford the mad-discussed mortality rates in universities. But the outcomes were not always better. Many still died, and so the knowledge kept moving, from old to young, from whispered chant to boiled cloth. It moved across generations, not because it was sanctioned, but because it worked. By the late 17th century, an anonymous collection of birthing advice began circulating in northern Italy. It bore no author's name, only a title: Del Parto, Segreti del Madre, Birth, the Mother's Secrets. Among its many entries are direct echoes of Antonia's phrases. Some are word for it. The text was dismissed by physicians, labeled superstition, forgotten by archivists. But in 1902, an Italian ethnography cataloging rural traditions in Emilia found a worn copy of Segreti del Madre, bound in homespun leather. Inside the front flap, in faint brown ink, was written, "For the daughters of those who remember Antonia." It was not just a document. It was a rebellion written in care, a memory disguised as advice, a resistance cloaked in motherhood. There were countless women like Antonia, women who treated infections when doctors refused to touch poor bodies, women who understood that healing wasn't only in bloodletting or leeches, but in warmth, presence, and knowing when to act. Women who were called witches when they succeeded where men had failed. Some were burned, some were drowned, most were erased, and yet their knowledge clung to the margins, passed not through schools, but through bread making and laundry folding and whispered conversations beside steaming copper basins. The history of medicine is told today is full of names: Paracelsus, Galen, Vesalius, Harvey, but the world was kept alive not only by those names, it was also kept alive by a woman kneeling beside a cot, whispering, "Breathe, child," by an old midwife drawing circles on a belly by candlelight dot, by Antonia de Carpe, whose notes outlived her, and whose memory, though stripped of title and tombstone, settled quietly into the bones of the land she served, not as myth, not as miracle, but as the stubborn fact that women's knowledge, once written into the body of a community, is never truly lost. It only becomes harder to read. What else has been sewn into the hems of forgotten skirts? And how many other silent revolutions are hidden in plain sight?